Hello, I'm Robin Osborne, Professor of Ancient History in the University of Cambridge, and my little talk today is intended to support study of the module on the Persian Empire. What I'm interested in today is where we get our information from. If we were talking about a period of recent history, that would seem to be a rather odd question. After all, if you ask about the Victorian period, there's so much information, there are so many possible sources of information, that there is no one place where we get our information from. And even about a single aspect of Victorian life, we are very unlikely to be drawing upon a single source, or even a single type of source. But for the whole of ancient history, the history of the Greeks and the Romans, the history of the Persians, our source material is much more limited. Indeed, we stand at the very beginnings of history because if you go back beyond the 6th century, in any of those parts of the world, it is extremely difficult to write any sort of account because we have virtually no source material. We have no textual material, and the archaeological material that we have enables us to tell only a rather different sort of story, often a story that doesn't have any historical actors' names in it at all. By contrast, of course, the story of the Persian Empire that you've been studying is full of claims about individual kings. It's built upon accounts of different reigns. And that's because we do have quite rich source material, but nothing like the sorts of source material we would have for a modern period. Where it is rich is that it comes from a number of different sources, not just, as it were, separate documents, but documents with a separate sort of origin. So one of the ways in which the imperial nature of the Persian Empire is reflected in our source material is that we get a perspective both from the center, we get sources that give us the sort of story that the Persian kings wanted to tell, and perspectives from those whom the Persians ruled over. So what their subjects wanted to say, and indeed, we get a perspective from those who were never subject to Persia at all. Our continuous account of the Persian Empire comes from a Greek writer, Herodotus, writing at the end of the 5th century BC, who was not himself part of the Persian Empire, but was looking at it from outside, looking at it indeed from the perspective of the Greeks, who regarded their great achievement to have been to have stopped the westward advance of the Persian Empire. So this gives us a variety of viewpoints for events which happen within the Persian Empire. And it's always going to be important that we know what viewpoint we're deriving our information from. We are, of course, perfectly familiar with having to take account of viewpoint when absorbing information about the contemporary world. We know that different newspapers have different slants upon the world. They are more or less critical of right-wing governments or left-wing governments or whatever it might be. And when we read them, we realize that, well, they would say that, wouldn't they, given their political, ideological, whatever position. We have to remember when we're reading historical sources that exactly the same is true. People don't write things down just at random. They write things down because they want their version to be preserved. Now, some historians precisely try to write a version that enables the particular slants of the stories that they hear to be pitted one against another in order to try to arrive at a fair account. But others, and not all our sources are historians in that sense, others write precisely to put across an account that is selective. Okay, that's enough by way of general introduction. What I want to do is to look pretty quickly at 3 Persian kings and at different source material and the different views it gives of those kings. And I shall start with Cyrus the Great. What I'm going to talk about may already be familiar to some of you, depending on how much you've studied. It will certainly become familiar to you. What I'm interested in doing is alerting you always to ask, where does this version come? Whose interest was it to tell the story like this? But let me start, for those of you who have not yet done much in the way of study of this module, let me start by literally putting us on the map, and I'll share my screen in order to show you a map. Cyrus II, in fact, was not the first of his family to be a ruler. He himself traces his ancestry back. There was, as the name Cyrus II implies, also a Cyrus I. Cyrus I ruled in this area around the capital that Cyrus II will also occupy, of Pasargadae here. And he ruled in this area of modern Iran, the area that's known as Fars, or sometimes as Parsa. We actually know pretty little of events up to the time of Cyrus himself, and we also know pretty little of why he came into conflict with the major powers to the west. But what we know is that he came into conflict first with the Kingdom of Media around Ecbatana here, and then with the Babylonian Empire, which ruled all the parts moving west from Babylon towards Egypt and right towards the Kingdom of Lydia, which Cyrus also engages with. And engaging with Lydia, he comes in contact with the Greeks, since the Lydian Empire butted against the Greek cities of Asia Minor, and the Greek cities had a somewhat equivocal relationship with the Lydian king of the time, Croesus. But that's another story. We know about Cyrus partly from his own words, or at least words that are attributed to him. We know about him also from the Hebrew scriptures, from the book of Ezra in the Old Testament in particular, as we'll see in a moment. And we know about him also from Herodotus, from a Greek. So we know about him as he wants to put himself across. We know about him as the subjects of the empire he's just taken over want to present him. And we know about him from what he looks like as an outsider, from an outsider's point of view. So let's look at how those viewpoints differ. And let me now move to my handout, which you can also download from the website. So if you'd like a copy of it, please do download it. For the purposes of this lecture, I'll share my screen, and you can see how I am using it. Cyrus gets a very good press in the Jewish scriptures. In the book of Ezra, right from the beginning of the book of Ezra, as you'll see from the passage that I've given you here, we are told that the crucial event is Cyrus restoring the people of the Jews to Jerusalem and restoring the temple there. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord moved the heart of Cyrus, king of Persia, to make a proclamation throughout his realm and also to put it in writing. This is what Cyrus, king of Persia, says: the Lord, the God of heavens, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he's appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah. Any of these people among you may go up to Jerusalem in Judah and build the temple of the Lord, the God of Israel, the God who is in Jerusalem, and may their God be with them. And in any locality where the survivors may now be living, the people are to provide them with silver and gold, with goods and livestock, and with freewill offerings for the temple of God in Jerusalem. So from this viewpoint, the Jews ascribe to their own God the motivating of Cyrus, so that Cyrus will allow them to return to Jerusalem and to build a temple and to worship their God. Cyrus himself presents his version of what his policy was on something that's become known as the Cyrus cylinder. This is a small clay object now in the British Museum, of which you see a picture here, written in Akkadian. It's only 10 inches or so long, but it gives an account of Cyrus's policy that was written to be displayed and probably deliberately buried in the sanctuary of the main Babylonian god Marduk in Babylon itself. And in the passage that I quote, Cyrus gives an account of his attitude toward the gods. From the sacred centers whose sanctuaries had been abandoned for a long time, I returned the images of the gods who had resided there to their place, and I let them dwell in eternal abodes. I gathered all their inhabitants and returned to them their dwellings. In addition, at the command of Marduk, the great lord, I settled in their habitations in pleasing abodes the gods of Sumer and Akkad, whom Nabonidus, to the anger of the Lord of the gods, had brought into Babylon. What Cyrus is doing here is claiming to reverse what had been an unpopular policy of the Babylonian Empire. He is reversing what Nabonidus has done in order to allow the peoples of the former Babylonian Empire, now his empire, to worship their own gods and to house them appropriately. Now, this doesn't itself explicitly concern the Jews, but you can see that the passage from the book of Ezra, from which we started, is a way of conceiving this policy from a Jewish point of view. The fact that they are allowed back and they are allowed to have a temple in the way that they have previously not been. What is presented in the book of Ezra as some special favour to the Jews appears here as part of a much wider policy. And indeed, that policy of religious toleration, has caused Cyrus to get a good press within modern treatments. This is a precedent that is seen to be a fine precedent, not just for the ancient world, but for the modern. However, if we look at the accounts that we get of Cyrus in Herodotus, I've not given you them here, but I've given you a reference to them, that version of Cyrus doesn't really appear at all. What Herodotus is fascinated by is how Cyrus manages his conquests. Cyrus in Herodotus is not somebody who is interested in particular in religion. He is interested in military action and in conquest. And he is clever. So he manages his conquests by things like diverting the waters of a river. You come to a river, how do you cross a river? Terribly difficult to cross a river. So he engages in all sorts of hydraulic works in order to split the river into many little streams, and you can then cross all the little streams. You don't have to cross the major waters of the river itself. This, no doubt, reflects in part the Greek admiration for the sorts of hydraulic, that is, use of rivers and water and canals and so on, that was a feature of the area of Mesopotamia. But it's a very different version of Cyrus from the Cyrus who is ideologically attached to allowing all different gods to thrive in their own place. That's not the side that the Greeks are interested in. It wouldn't be sensible for us either to take the policy of Cyrus towards the gods of the peoples of his newly acquired empire and to be his only interest as a conqueror. But nor would it be sensible for us simply to see him as a clever military man in the way he's presented in Herodotus. We've got partial views here. And Cyrus was no doubt many things, and we just happen to have these different aspects preserved. Much more striking is the picture we get of Cyrus' successor Cambyses. Here again, we can trace a series of different views. What I'm showing you on the screen is a statue of an Egyptian called Udahareshnet. This is actually a statue that is now in the Vatican Museum, and it's in the Vatican Museum almost certainly because the Roman Emperor Hadrian acquired this as part of his Egyptian collection and put this up in his villa just outside Rome. What it shows is Udahareshnet carrying the god Osiris. And as you can see, this is written all over with the autobiography of Udahareshnet. Now, Udahareshnet is a figure who holds an official position in the Persian Empire, but he's an Egyptian. So he is, as it were, a collaborator. He is someone who, when Cambyses came and conquered Egypt, joined in with the Persians. Not surprisingly, then, you get a version of what happened from Udahareshnet that is pretty positive. When King Cambyses arrived at Sais, his majesty came himself to the temple of Neith. He made a great prostration before her majesty, as every king has done. He made presents to the almighty goddess of all things, to Neith, the mighty one, the divine mother, and to the gods who are in Sais, all as all pious kings have done. His majesty did this because I had instructed him as to the grandeur of the goddess, as being the mother of the sun god himself. So Udahareshnet is bigging himself up here, but he is also claiming that Cambyses acted in a totally traditional way and an appropriately pious way. That indeed seems to be not just the collaborator's story, but, and not surprisingly, the official story. So we have a sarcophagus of the Apis bull, the way in which the god Apis was worshipped, which refers to Cambyses. Horus, uniter of two lands, king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Mesutire, son of Re, Cambyses, may he live forever. He has made a fine monument for his father, Apis Osiris, with a great granite sarcophagus dedicated by the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Mesutire, son of Re, Cambyses. May he live forever in perpetuity and prosperity, full of health and joy, as king of Upper and Lower Egypt eternally. Well, you might say, he would say that, wouldn't he? And you might in particular say that if you juxtapose this to the account you get from Herodotus. Herodotus has a view of Cambyses where Cambyses doesn't at all simply conform and adopt traditional patterns of behavior. What Cambyses does, according to Herodotus, is to be hostile and towards Egyptian religion, and in particular towards Apis. He ridicules the Apis bull. So Herodotus says, I've given you this passage from Herodotus 3, when the priests led Apis in, Cambyses, for he was all but mad, drew his dagger and, meaning to stab the calf in the belly, struck the thigh. Then laughing, he said to the priests, simpleton, are these your gods, creatures of flesh and blood that can feel weapons of iron? That is a god worthy of the Egyptians. But for you, you shall suffer for making me your laughingstock. So saying, he bade those whose business it was to scourge the priests well and to kill any other Egyptian whom they found holiday making. So the Egyptian festival ended, and the priests were punished, and Apis lay in the temple and died of the wound in the thigh. When he was dead of the wound, the priests buried him without Cambyses' knowledge. So far here from Cambyses engaging in traditional worship, Cambyses rejects traditional worship, and far from the Apis bull simply dying naturally, the Apis bull dies because killed by Cambyses. Where does Herodotus' story come from? Well, it clearly must come from those in Egypt who were hostile to Cambyses, hostile to Persian rule, who were not collaborators like Ujaharesnet, but who saw the arrival of Persian overlords as something to be resisted. And the story they wanted to put out was not that the Apis bull just happened to have died, but that the Apis bull died because killed by Cambyses. Can we tell what happened in the end? This is a case where we simply can't. We know what the official story was. We know what the critics said. But we are no longer in a position to make a judgment between the two. Finally, let me turn to King Darius. Darius I. Darius I leaves us great accounts of himself. He leaves them in two places. He leaves them in a place called Naxirustan, close to Pasargadae, which is the place where the kings of Persia were buried. He leaves them also at a place called Bisatun, which is between Babylon and Ecbatana, and has a great monument, which I'll show you in a moment. Many different Persian kings left their mark at Bisatun, and Darius in particular has an account of his coming to power there. And we know about Darius, of course, also, again, from Herodotus, who is the constant within this picture. So, what does Darius look like as presented by Darius? I am Darius, he writes, the place where he's buried, the great king, king of kings, king of countries containing all kinds of men, king of this earth, this great earth far and wide, son of Hystaspes and Achaemenid, a Persian, son of a Persian, an Aryan, having an Aryan lineage. King Darius says, by the favor of Ahura Mazda, these are the countries which I seized outside of Persia. I ruled over them. They bore tribute to me. They did what was said to me by them, to them by me. They held my law firmly. Media, Elam, Parthia, Aria, Bactria, Sogdia, Harasmia, Drangiana, Harachosia, Safahedia, Kandara, India, the Homer drinking Scythians, the Scythians with pointed caps, Babylonia, Assyria, Arabia, Egypt, Armenia, Cappadocia, Lydia, the Greeks, the Scythians across the sea, Thrace, the Petasus wearing Greeks, wearing a particular sort of hat, the Libyans, the Nubians, the men of Makkah, and the Carians. He is the great imperial conqueror. He is proud of the extent of his empire. He's proud of it to such an extent that he includes within it peoples whom he never actually managed to conquer. There were some Greeks who came within the Persian Empire. So we can allow the Greeks a presence here, though exactly how he wants to distinguish his Greeks and his Petasus wearing Greeks is not clear. But what about these Scythians? The Homer drinking Scythians and the Scythians with pointed caps. When we read Herodotus' account, we do indeed learn that Darius went on a great expedition to conquer Scythia, that is the area to the north of the Black Sea. But he was defeated. Scythia never comes within the Persian Empire. But from the point of view of the heartland of empire, nobody knows that. They know there's been a great campaign. It's all too far away for them to have any idea what the truth might be. So Darius can present himself as he does. You can see both the script here and the image, can present himself as uniformly successful, ruling over every people he comes into contact with. And here you can see what a splendid monument he creates. One of these sections is Darius. Different kings have different sections to put forward their own image at Naxios time. But at Bisitoon, Darius doesn't simply present himself for what he achieved, doesn't just present the power of empire, as he does at Naxios time. He presents how he got to be powerful. He gives us an account of his rise to power. He identifies himself again. He identifies his ancestry, as you can see in the extract that I've given you here. This is an inscription, incidentally, written up not just in one language, but in three, in Old Persian, in Elamite, and in Babylonian. This is meant to be read, known, talked about by as many people across the empire as possible. And if you can't read it, you can see it. So here you have Darius. He has his foot on a victim, we'll see in a moment. And then he has all these other peoples lining up to pay homage with him. His account of how he becomes king is important because we can compare it directly with the account that Herodotus gives of how he becomes king. I'm not now going to read through this account, since you can do so yourself from my handout. But you will see that his account holds that Cambyses has a brother, Smerdis, whom Cambyses kills because he thinks his brother might be a rival. This gives an opportunity for another person who has no relationship at all to Cambyses to pretend to be Smerdis, and therefore to assert himself as a contender for power. Darius and a number of others become aware of what has happened. Cambyses' murder of Smerdis had not been a public thing, so that's what gave an opportunity to the false Smerdis to assert himself. But Darius and a number of others become aware of this, and they take action to get rid of the false Smerdis. And Darius then, with the help of these others, manages to put himself into power. And that's the account that he gives. Herodotus has, in fact, a very, very similar account. And indeed, we can identify the various helpers who work with Darius, and who are listed in the Bisatoon inscription. We can identify those with the names that are given in Herodotus' own account. So here we have the official account, and we have the account written from the outside of the empire, both appearing to agree. So that's what happened, is it? Well, here is a case where we have to ask again about what the sources are. Herodotus' account of Cambyses comes from Egyptian sources who are hostile. His account, however, of how Darius got to power must come, in fact, from Darius' own account. These are not independent confirmations of each other. Herodotus has derived, maybe not directly, but at least indirectly, his account of Darius' rise to power from Darius' own account of his rise to power. And that's not surprising, because actually how Darius got power was of great interest to Darius, and no doubt of great interest to the rivals potentially for power within Persia. But it was of little interest to the people of Egypt or the people of Greece, either if you were a subject nation within the empire or if you're outside the empire, exactly how the Persian king came to be Persian king really didn't matter at all. No one is going to go on telling stories about that in the way that the Egyptians will go on telling stories about how terrible Cambyses was, because that's a way of alerting people to the ongoing questions that arise from Persian rule. Are they or aren't they conforming to Egyptian traditions? So, when we get Herodotus' version here appearing to confirm Darius' own version, unfortunately, all we can conclude is that Herodotus has done his homework quite well. Herodotus has actually asked about, and he's discovered people who were well aware of this official version and who could repeat it to him. What one discovers, however, if one reads Herodotus, and I leave you to go away and to do this, is that Herodotus frames this Persian version of how Darius got power with an extremely Greek frame. He does give us all this story about the false Smerdis and all the court intrigue. But he also gives us a debate in Persia about how Persia should be ruled. This is book 3, chapter 80. It's a debate about whether you should have kingship or whether you should be ruled by a group of a few people, have an oligarchy, as it's called, or whether you should give political power to everybody and have a democracy. Those are questions that are really alive and well in the Greek world. And at any point where a city is thinking about or made to think about how it's ruling itself, has some sort of internal constitutional crisis, those are the choices. One man rule, rule by a few, however one chooses the few, rule by everybody. But for the Persian Empire, at the point that Darius comes to power, it's extraordinarily unlikely that questions about the constitution were being raised in this way. It is indeed impossible to think what a democracy would look like that ruled not just a Greek city-state, but this vast area of the empire. So what we get in Herodotus is, on the one hand, a taking over of a purely Persian story, and on the other, a framing to use the taking over of power by Darius as something good to think with from a Greek audience's point of view, thinking about the creation of power in a state. What happens if you have a constitutional crisis? Where do you go from there? In that particular case, no modern scholar, I think, wants to believe that Herodotus has any historical basis for that debate having taken place between Darius and his colleagues. But that's a rare case where we might want totally to dismiss a story. More often, what we've got is stories that are either economical with the truth, they don't tell us everything, or generous with the truth. They embroider on what might have been a much more simple or a much less favourable actual set of circumstances. As we pick our way through Persian history, we need to ask where our information comes from and to think about how much we have got sources that are giving the version that they would say, wouldn't they, given who they are. Thank you very much.